Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Chronicles. If you're enjoying the story, drop a like and hit subscribe button. Your support really motivates me to create more videos like this. It was during the summer of 2015 when I first heard of the Skinwalker. I had been traveling across Arizona, working as a wildlife photographer, capturing the desolate beauty of the desert landscapes. One evening, I found myself driving through a remote area near the Navajo Nation, far from any signs of civilization. My GPS had gone out, and I was relying on an old map I had found in a gas station. I wasn't too concerned, as I figured I could find my way back once I got my shots. As night fell, the eerie stillness of the desert set in. The winds had picked up, kicking up dust clouds that painted the landscape with a sepia-toned hue. I parked my truck on a dirt road that wound through an area of low brush, hoping to capture the moonlit view of the surrounding mountains. But that's when I heard something. It was faint at first, a rustling noise coming from somewhere behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see a small animal, but there was nothing. I dismissed it, focusing on my camera. As I moved closer to the edge of a nearby ridge to get a better angle, I heard it again, louder this time. It was a low, guttural growl, almost like the sound of something large breathing heavily. My heart rate spiked, and I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the shadows. But again, I saw nothing. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, and I told myself it was just my imagination. That's when I noticed it. At the far end of the ridge, I saw something standing still. It was a figure, too large to be a coyote, but too human-like to be any other animal. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure seemed to be staring at me, unmoving, like it was studying me, waiting. I don't know why, but something about it felt wrong. The hairs on my neck stood up, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me. I reached into my bag for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the figure began moving. It wasn't walking like a person. Its limbs jerked, unnaturally elongated, and it seemed to glide across the ground, almost as if it was floating. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I was sure it was watching me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I had heard of the Skinwalker legends before, but never took them seriously, until now. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't human. I knew that much. I could hear its breathing, now rasping and harsh, growing louder as it moved closer. Its shape seemed to shift, morphing in and out of something more monstrous with every step it took. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The creature's head tilted slightly, as if it was amused by my terror. Then, in the distance, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, distorted and wrong. It was calling my name, but it wasn't my name. The voice was trying to imitate my mother's, but there was something deeply unnatural about it. "Come closer, child," it whispered. "I just want to talk." My mind screamed that this was no person, no lost soul in need of help. This was the Skinwalker, the creature that could mimic human voices to lure you into the wilderness, where it would feast on your fear. As I slowly turned to leave, I heard the growl again, closer this time. I turned my head just in time to see the figure leap towards me. It was faster than I could process, its twisted form moving with an inhuman speed. I didn't think, I just ran. My legs burned as I sprinted back towards my truck, but the sound of the creature's footsteps was behind me, relentless, too fast to outrun. As I reached my truck, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I could hear it closing in, its breath like something that had been dragged from the depths of hell. Finally, the truck door opened, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely get the engine to start. The creature stopped just outside my window, its shadow looming over me. I locked the doors, staring into the dark void of its eyes. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, but eventually, it moved away, retreating into the desert night. I don't know how long I sat there, staring out the windshield, too terrified to move. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see, but I could feel it watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The next morning, I drove out of the area as fast as I could, never looking back. I didn't talk about the encounter for years. Even now, I can't fully explain what I saw. All I know is that the skinwalker is real, and it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. Every time I drive through the desert now, I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me, waiting for me to make one wrong turn. It was during a summer camping trip in northern Arizona when I first encountered the skinwalker. A few friends and I had decided to take a weekend away from the city, get out into nature, and escape the chaos. We set up camp deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just a few nights under the stars, but things quickly took a dark turn. The first night, we sat around the fire, telling stories, laughing, and drinking. The woods were silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of leaves. But then, around midnight, we heard something. A distant howl, like a coyote, but deeper, more guttural. It sent a chill down my spine. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just an animal, but my friends were unnerved too. We decided to stay close to the fire, no one wanting to venture off into the dark. As the night went on, the noises continued. They weren't just animal sounds anymore. There was something off about them. Something that didn't belong. The howls turned into screams, almost human, but twisted and distorted, echoing through the trees. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed, unsure of what to make of it. One of my friends, Jason, joked about it being a skinwalker, trying to lighten the mood, but I could tell he wasn't laughing. Neither was I. My grandmother had warned me about them when I was younger. She had grown up in the Navajo Nation and always spoke of the dark creatures that roamed the desert at night. She told me to never venture into the woods after dark, to never let my guard down. She said skinwalkers could take on the form of any animal, even humans, and were capable of imitating voices. I shook off the thought, telling myself it was just a myth. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer, circling our camp. I could feel it. Something was watching us. I wanted to stay calm, but the air felt heavy, thick with dread. We stayed by the fire, too afraid to sleep, constantly listening for the next sound. Around 2 a.m., we heard something else. A voice, faint at first but growing clearer. It sounded like Jason's younger brother, Daniel, who hadn't come on the trip with us. The voice called out, softly at first, then more urgently, "Help me! It's cold! I'm lost!" We all froze. Daniel's voice didn't belong in the woods. He wasn't supposed to be here. Jason stood up, looking panicked, but the rest of us held him back. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had wandered off, but we all knew deep down that something wasn't right. The voice called again, louder this time, as if it was right outside the campfire's light. "Jason, it's me. I need help. I'm scared." Jason looked torn, his face pale. I could see the struggle in his eyes. But then, something in the woods rustled, followed by a low growl. The voice fell silent, replaced by a deep, menacing laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, now sounding completely wrong, like it was someone, or something, mocking Jason's brother. The laugh echoed through the trees, and we all jumped to our feet, terrified. I glanced around, trying to locate where the sound had come from, but I couldn't see anything in the dark, beyond the flickering firelight. Jason, still visibly shaken, grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the woods, calling out for Daniel. The rest of us screamed for him to stop, but he didn't listen. I felt a sense of impending doom as he disappeared into the shadows, the flashlight bobbing like a weak beacon in the vast darkness. We waited, unable to move, as the sounds around us intensified. I heard twigs snap, something moving fast and low to the ground, circling the camp. Then came the howl again, but this time, it was closer. Too close. A guttural scream split the air, followed by Jason's frantic voice. "Help me. It's not him. It's not Daniel." My heart raced as we all ran in the direction of his screams. We found him a few minutes later, crouched behind a tree, eyes wide with terror. He was breathing heavily, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It wasn't Daniel," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It was something else. It was wrong. It had his voice, but it wasn't him. It was a trick." We didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed him and ran back to the campsite, the sounds of something chasing us just beyond the tree line. It followed us until we reached the safety of our tents, where we huddled together in silence, too afraid to sleep. The rest of the night was uneventful, but the fear lingered, crawling under our skin. When morning came, we packed up quickly and left the woods, not even looking back. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. It wasn't an animal, and it certainly wasn't human. But whatever it was, it knew how to manipulate fear. The voice it had used wasn't Daniel's, and I could hear the malice in it, like it had been playing with us. Some say skinwalkers can control animals and use them to draw people into the wilderness. Others believe they can shapeshift and walk in the skins of others, pretending to be someone you know, luring you closer so they can take you. Whatever it was, I'll never forget that voice. Distorted, mocking, and full of hunger. And I'll never set foot in those woods again. I never believed in the stories about skinwalkers. Growing up in a small town in Arizona, surrounded by Navajo legends and tales of the supernatural, I always assumed they were just that, stories. That was until one fateful night in the desert when I realized I had no choice but to believe. It all began when my cousin Jamie invited me out for a camping trip in the middle of nowhere, far from the nearest town. She had grown up in the area, familiar with the land and the stories. Despite hearing the whispers of skinwalkers from locals, I brushed them off as old myths meant to scare kids. We set up camp on a quiet, remote patch of land, the stars above us shining brighter than I had ever seen before. As we sat by the fire, Jamie shared one of the local legends, the tale of a skinwalker, a shapeshifter who wore the skin of animals and could mimic human voices to lure their victims. She spoke about how the creatures were said to be witches who practiced dark magic, capable of turning into wolves, coyotes, and even people. I laughed, thinking it was just a spooky story. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The wind picked up, rustling the trees in a way that felt almost unnatural. At one point, Jamie stood up to gather some more firewood, and as she walked into the darkness, I heard something odd. A low, gravelly voice calling her name. It wasn't hers. It wasn't even close. The voice was hoarse, guttural, and distorted, almost as if it came from a throat that wasn't meant to speak. I stood up, trying to see through the darkness, but the firelight barely reached beyond the camp. "Jamie?" I called out. There was no response, but I could still hear the voice, faintly calling her name again, over and over. It was closer now, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The voice sounded so much like hers, yet completely wrong. I called again, this time more urgently. No answer. I couldn't just stay there, so I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went, the more the wind howled and the more disorienting the sounds became. The voice continued to echo, but now it was accompanied by something else, faint, scuttling noises, like something, or someone, moving just out of sight. I paused for a moment, trying to gather my courage, but then the voice changed. It was no longer just Jamie's name being called. It was something much darker. "Come closer," it beckoned. I knew it wasn't her. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't just leave her out here. I pushed forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the trees in front of me. I was close. I could feel it. Then, suddenly, I froze. Just a few feet ahead of me, I saw her. Or at least I thought it was her. She was standing still, facing away from me. Her posture was stiff, unnaturally so. The faint glow from the flashlight revealed her figure, but something was off. Her hair hung too long, and her arms were unnervingly thin. I stepped forward, calling her name softly, but as I did, I heard a snap, a twig breaking underfoot behind me. I whirled around, my heart racing, but when I looked back at her, she was gone. The figure that had stood before me had vanished. A cold chill washed over me, and I felt the weight of something sinister in the air. The scuttling noises came again, closer this time, and I turned to see a shadow moving quickly through the trees. My blood ran cold as I realized something was wrong, dead wrong. Then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the light from my flashlight, peered at me from the darkness. It was too high off the ground, too large to be any animal I had seen. The figure moved, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. A twisted, grotesque shape. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its skin stretched tight over its bones. And in its hands were pieces of animal fur, like it had been wearing them, tearing them off in some sick ritual. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the creature took a step forward, the skin of its face pulling back to reveal a horrifying grin. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it mimicked Jamie's voice one last time, this time in a mocking tone. "Why did you leave me?" Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear the creature following me, its footsteps almost silent, its breath ragged and heavy. My feet stumbled over the uneven ground, but I didn't dare stop, not until I reached the campsite. When I finally made it back, I found Jamie, sitting by the fire, looking at me like I had lost my mind. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. I couldn't speak. I was too terrified. We left the campsite immediately, not even bothering to pack up the gear. As we drove back to town, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. But there was nothing. Despite what happened, part of me still questioned it. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Had I imagined the entire thing? But as we drove past the desert hills, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. Movement. Unnatural and fast, disappearing into the night. That was the last time I ever set foot in those woods. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know one thing for sure. It was no man, no animal. It was something far darker, something that wears the skin of those it hunts. And I will never forget the look in its eyes. I had always been a skeptic, never fully believing in the old stories my grandmother used to tell me about the skinwalkers. She'd speak of them in hushed tones, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone might hear. The tales were always the same, shapeshifters that wore the skin of animals, able to mimic human voices, luring people into the woods to never return. I thought it was just folklore, nothing more. But that changed the summer of my 23rd year, the summer I learned the truth. It started with a camping trip I had planned with a few friends. We'd chosen a secluded spot near the Navajo reservation, far from the beaten path, wanting to get away from everything for a few days. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but the first night, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, and the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional owl, seemed absent. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, trying to ignore the strange silence. That's when we heard it. A rustling in the trees behind us, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone crying. It sounded like a woman, weak and distressed. "Did you hear that?" my friend Tyler asked, his voice tinged with unease. "It's probably just an animal," I replied, though even I wasn't sure. We waited in silence for a moment, listening intently. The crying grew louder, more desperate. "Help me," the voice sobbed. "Please help me." It sounded like it was coming from the woods just beyond our camp. Tyler stood up. "I'm gonna check it out," he said, but I grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy? It's probably just someone messing with us." But Tyler was already walking toward the sound. "Stay here, I'll be back in a minute." I watched him disappear into the darkness, the firelight flickering as if reluctant to reveal the depths of the forest. Minutes passed and Tyler didn't return. A chill ran through me as I stood up, telling my other friends we needed to go after him. We grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods, the cry still echoing in the distance, growing fainter with each step. The deeper we went, the more unnatural the forest felt. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air grew colder, heavy with a palpable sense of dread. We called out for Tyler, but there was no response, just the eerie sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. Then, suddenly, the crying stopped. In its place was a low, guttural laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. "Tyler?" I called, but the laugh continued, mocking, predatory. It wasn't Tyler's voice. It was something wrong. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize what was happening. "It's just an animal," I told myself. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just an animal. Something was watching us. Something was hunting us. We stumbled upon a clearing, and there in the center, we found him. Tyler was kneeling on the ground, his body motionless, his head hanging low. At first I thought he was unconscious, but then I noticed something horrifying. His clothes were torn, as if something had clawed at them, and his skin was pale, almost gray. But what terrified me the most were his eyes, wide open, but lifeless, as if whatever had been inside him was no longer there. A flash of movement caught my eye. Something in the trees, moving impossibly fast, almost a blur. Then it was gone. "What the hell is happening?" my friend Jessica whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. The voice, the laugh, Tyler's lifeless eyes. There was only one explanation: the skinwalker. We backed away slowly, fear flooding my veins, but then the figure appeared. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that bent at grotesque angles. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and sickly, like it was wearing someone else's flesh. Its face was a twisted mockery of a man, but there was no mistaking the eyes, black, empty voids that seemed to pull in the light. It grinned at us, and in that moment, I felt something deep in my gut, the instinct to run. We didn't hesitate. We turned and bolted, not daring to look back. The sound of the skinwalker's footsteps followed us, but it never quite caught up. We ran until we could hear nothing but our own ragged breath, until the forest seemed to fall silent once more. When we finally made it back to the campsite, we found Tyler's backpack, his flashlight, but no sign of him. The skinwalker had taken him. We left the forest that night, never looking back. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that voice in the distance, calling out for help, and I know it's not a person, but the thing that took him. And when I close my eyes at night, I can still see those black, empty eyes staring at me from the darkness. I learned that night that the skinwalkers aren't just stories. They're real, and they will find you if you stray too far into their domain. I grew up on a small ranch in New Mexico, far from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but desert and the occasional wind howling through the mesquite trees. We were used to the isolation, but there was something about the land that never felt quite right. It wasn't until I was in my late teens that I learned of the creature that haunted the area, the skinwalker. My grandfather used to warn me about them, but as a kid, I dismissed it as one of those old, superstitious tales. That was until the night I encountered it. It all started when my father sent me to check on the livestock late one evening. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch. I was walking towards the barn when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of desert, a shiver creeping down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I approached the barn, I heard a voice, a soft whisper carried by the wind, "Help me." It was my mother's voice, or at least it sounded like her. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around but saw nothing. The voice repeated, this time closer, almost as if it was right behind me. I whipped around again, but still, there was nothing. The air grew cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My feet were frozen to the ground, but I had to keep moving. The sound of my mother's voice grew louder, more desperate. I finally forced myself to walk into the barn, but there was no sign of her. Only the animals, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, as if the barn itself was holding its breath. Just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the shadows. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too twisted. It stood there, watching me. And then, the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't my mother's. It was something deeper, guttural, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I ran from the barn, the sound of those footsteps following me, but faster, closing in. The desert seemed to stretch on forever as I sprinted toward the house, the whispering voice still haunting me. When I finally reached the safety of the front door, I slammed it shut behind me, panting and wide-eyed. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, I told my father what had happened. He didn't say much, but the look on his face said it all. He'd seen it too. That afternoon, he took me to the edge of the property, to a small clearing where the old animals used to roam. "This is where it happens," he said, his voice low. "The skinwalkers, they feed off fear, off the living. They can take any form they want, wear the skin of those they've killed, and mimic their voices. But it's never really them. It's a monster in their skin, feeding on your fear." I was too terrified to even speak, but I knew from that moment on, the ranch was never safe. The creature didn't just live in the desert, it was in the very air, lurking, waiting for the right moment. I learned to never go out after dark, to always keep my distance from the barn, and to never trust my own ears. But that wasn't enough. One evening, months later, I was sitting on the porch when I heard something outside, something that sounded like my mother calling me, asking me to come closer. My heart raced. I looked around, and there she was, standing at the edge of the property, bathed in the pale light of the moon. But something was wrong. Her posture was off, her movements jerky, unnatural. I knew it wasn't her, not really. But my mind betrayed me, and I took a step toward her, my feet moving against my will. "Mom?" I called, but the voice that answered wasn't hers. It was the same guttural, malicious tone that had followed me in the barn. I froze, the terror flooding through me, paralyzing me in place. "You should have stayed away," the voice hissed. And that's when I saw it. The figure was changing, twisting. The skin was pulling tight, stretching over the bones, as the shape morphed into something monstrous. It was no longer my mother, but something that should never exist in the world of the living. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It lunged toward me, but I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, not daring to look back. I could hear its footsteps behind me, faster now, the sound of it closing in, but I made it back to the house, slamming the door shut just as it reached the threshold. I spent the rest of that night with my back to the door, waiting for the inevitable. But it never came. The next morning, I found no sign of the creature. No prints, no traces of anything unusual. It was as if it had never been there. But I knew the truth. The skinwalker was still out there, waiting, watching, and it was only a matter of time before it would come for me again.